Welcome everyone. We can see a number of people are joining us and still coming into the platform. So welcome everyone that is joining us for this important session. So I hope you joined the right session. This one's focused on accessing legal advice. My name's Katie. I'm director at Cymorth, Cymru in Wales. We run the Welsh Frontline Network, but you won't be hearing too much from me in this session because I'm just chairing, and we've got some incredible experts who are going to be sharing their knowledge with you. This session's being held to address some of the key issues raised by frontline staff in the UK in the 2024 Frontline Worker Survey. So really great to see that the responses that you put into that survey are really listened to and helped shape today's conference. And one of the key issues was about access to legal advice in the absence of legal aid. Staff who responded to that survey cited different barriers that prevent people that they are working with from accessing basic homelessness prevention. And this is including examples of things like increased use of intentionality to stop people getting the help that they need, failure to appropriately recognise priority need, and breakdown of communication between services. So we're really pleased that this session will include speakers from across different parts of the UK. It'll explore advocacy, how to access legal advice, partnership working, and resources available to frontline workers. I've also been told that we have a short briefing on housing legal aid in England, and that's going to be circulated to attendees. So do keep an eye out for that. It's got some really useful information on what legal aid can help with, who can get legal aid, and a bunch of other information which will hopefully be incredibly useful to you when supporting people who are experiencing or at risk of homelessness. So today we've got a fantastic panel. So we've got Aaliya Seyal from Legal Services Agency, who's the chief executive there. We're hearing from JJ Costello, who's head of housing services at Shelter Cymru, and Jill Downing, who's a solicitor with Housing Rights Northern Ireland. So really, really pleased to have such an amazingly talented bunch of experts here, and I'm sure they're going to communicate some really important information that will help you as you support people in the future. So we're going to be hearing from each of the speakers for about 10 minutes each, who are going to provide an overview from their perspective. We've got some questions, but please do submit your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible following the presentations. So I think first up we've got Aaliya, so please do share your presentation and welcome to the session.
Thank you so much, Katie. It's lovely to be here and see so many participants and be able to be in this virtual setting. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about Legal Services Agency as a whole, and specifically focusing on our work in preventing homelessness. And I am very ably going to be assisted in the slides being shared for me. So I'm assuming that we've got the slides on screen. Perfect, thank you. So just wanted to give a little bit of background about Legal Services Agency. I joined Legal Services Agency, which is a law centre based in Scotland. We're the second oldest law centre in 2019, so just before the pandemic hit. So it was a very interesting induction period. But my background has been in law centres, Citizens Advice Bureau, Citizens Advice Scotland. So really what I deem to be as the voluntary legal advice sector. LSA is nearly 34 years old. We were established in 1989, but formally constituted in 1990. And it started in providing advice focusing on housing and homelessness. So it started from really architects who discovered that there was a lot of dampness, disrepair issues, and that legal advice was necessary. So I think that history was really quite important in how it developed. And then focusing on other areas of law has really been led by what communities need from us. So we are based in Glasgow, where our head office is, and we've got an office in Greenock. But some of our projects are Scotland-wide, so that's why you've got a little map there of Scotland. We've always focused on providing advice to people who are experiencing multiple forms of disadvantage. And our primary objective is to ensure that they have somebody who is on their side to be able to advise them of their legal rights and to be able to represent them as well. And we have a considerable reputation of being able to push legal boundaries and advance legal rights, and through that, really be addressing systemic failures, which I'm sure that we're going to hear more about later today from my colleagues as well. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Can I just check on my screen? I'm not seeing that the slide have moved on. Okay, great, thank you. So although we started providing advice in relation to housing issues, we have expanded. So I wanted to just give a rundown very quickly of the different areas of law that LSA specialises in. First and foremost, it is housing, preventing homelessness. Linked with that, we often find that there are social welfare issues. Alongside preventing homelessness from when it happens first, we also do address unsuitable accommodation. We have a mental health department where we provide representation to people who are detained under the Mental Health Act. We have a lot of expertise in providing advice to adults with incapacity, so with guardianships and power of attorneys. And again, through sort of reviewing the work that we were undertaking, we saw that a lot of our clients were not aware that they had the right to be able to put in a claim through criminal injuries compensation. So we developed that as an element of our work, and through some of our cases have actually achieved being able to change the law. Moving on to the next slide, please. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of inquiries coming in about employment issues. So that could range from furlough to health and safety, redundancy situations. So we re-established our employment law practice, and really what we want to be doing is focusing on protecting employment rights and challenging unfair treatment of employees. We noticed with a lot of our work, whether that was housing, mental health, or employment, that there are undoubtedly welfare benefit issues. So we work in collaboration with a number of providers to be able to signpost people where it is submitting an application, and or working with our partners where it is challenging a refusal of a welfare benefits decision. And we've got particular interest in upper tribunals and judicially reviewing benefit decisions. And naturally, taking all of that into consideration, we have a very strong element of legal education. And we do that through sort of three main streams. One is public legal education, so raising awareness within the community and our partner organisations, but also raising capacity within the legal sector. So we are a registered CPD provider, and through our work, we will produce reports where we have the resource to be able to do so, and we've identified trends and, again, publications to raise that awareness. So moving on to the next slide. Through the course of the work that we undertake, there are many issues that we see in relation to what are the sort of causes of homelessness. And we know that there are structural issues, we know that there are societal issues, and then we also know that there are political drivers. But inequality plays a large part in what we see through our work, and that circle is very deliberately sort of bigger than the other three, and that inequality we see through for children, we see that in LGBTQI communities, we see it for Black and minority ethnic communities, women experiencing domestic abuse, poverty, gypsy travellers, unsuitable accommodation, asylum seekers, issues around trafficking, the impact of adverse childhood experiences, and people who have irregular immigration status and no recourse to public funds. I think so. First and foremost, we have to recognise that within homelessness itself, the inequality and the various drivers and the systems that are so difficult to navigate. If we then move on to the next slide. So I think to be able to achieve this, what we certainly feel is that everyone does have a role in achieving that system change. What we try to do, either directly through the work that we undertake and or collaborating with other partners, is first and foremost, our approach to advising people is to understand what the root cause is that is leading to them facing difficulties in their housing situation. Through the work that we do with our partners, we think that there are things that we can influence in terms of campaigning for changes. But going back to the actual individual that's in front of you, I think first and foremost, that sort of human rights approach of making sure that the assistance that you are providing, the advice that you're providing, the representation that you're providing, that that person remains at the centre of everything that is being done, not for them, but with them, sort of really empowering them to understand what their rights are, and hopefully be able to avoid sort of repeat cycles of homelessness from happening. So I think the first approach that we have is to try and prevent homelessness before it occurs. And the other points that I've noted on that particular slide are really with that viewpoint of that system change. So if we are gathering information, that it is used purposefully, and that certainly through our work, what we are seeing is that we can use those legal remedies that we are identifying to actually be able to reform and change policies, change legislation. And we've certainly done that working closely with our partners as well as the Scottish Government. So if we move on to the next slide. So that very neatly takes me on to the role of the law. So international law aside, in terms of housing, Scotland has one of the most progressive legislations. But alongside that, I think it is for us to remember that the European Convention on Human Rights, Articles 3 and 8 are very relevant in housing and homelessness. Again, in terms of the Equality Act, the Public Sector Equality Duty, again, is very relevant in housing and homelessness. So our team definitely use the expertise that they have, not only in housing legislation, but also tapping in other legislation where it is applicable to housing and homelessness. So if we then move on to the next slide. So here I wanted to just highlight some of the things that our team has done in terms of using the law. So we have, in terms of unsuitable accommodation, dampness, disrepair, we've represented many clients to resolve the issue, but also be able to obtain compensation. We have, through some of the work that we've undertaken, brought first cases, whether that was in relation to the tenancy deposit scheme, whether it is testing the jurisdiction of tribunals to be able to hear certain aspects of cases, and also the first successful application in terms of a wrongful termination order. So the team's got a breadth of expertise, and they definitely are very happy to flex their arms and test and push boundaries. We haven't been able to achieve all of what I've outlined on our own. So I think here I just want to highlight sort of the power of the collaboration and the power that everybody on this call has in terms of being able to ensure that we can provide that person-centered advice, that we can achieve those system changes, and that we can help in how a person gets to the end solution that is in their interest without re-traumatizing the person and without them having to repeat their circumstances. So some of the things that we have done here is we have a whole range of partners that we work with who have different areas of expertise. That ensures that already stretched resources are more effectively used, that each of us is bringing our expertise to the table. We've got some really good examples of preventative work that we have been able to achieve through support of the Scottish Government and or other trusts and foundations. We provide an emergency help desk in Glasgow Sheriff Court and Dumbarton Sheriff Court, which we applied the learning from Glasgow to take it into another area. So where people are undergoing court proceedings and do not have legal representation, our solicitors are there to be able to represent them on the day. So again, sort of preventing homelessness from before it happens. And we've got another project which is focusing specifically on people that are or have engaged in the criminal justice system. So that is providing advice to people that are going into prison of their housing rights and or at the point of liberation so that they are not going into homelessness. So if we move on to the final slide, please. So I think here really what I wanted to highlight is the examples that I've just explained in the previous slide, how all of that can empower the communities that we are here to be able to assist. Building referral pathways, and I think what in my experience has been the strongest is not necessarily the documentation that sits behind partnerships, but actually the working relationships and being able to attend, whether it's sort of just literally team meetings to raise awareness of what is the appropriate point at which you want to be escalating for legal advice. What is action that you can be taking? Where is it crucial that this is now becoming absolutely urgent? And then being able to use our collective evidence to be able to attend networking meetings, contribute towards the campaigning. In Scotland, we've got a couple of really good examples of the Everyone Home Collective, which is a group of advice agencies, legal advice, campaigning, academia, people that are focused on evaluation. So really just bringing together that diverse expertise. And then the Scottish Government have also got a homeless prevention strategy group. And that, again, has got diverse experience, including lived experience. And I think all of those factors are really quite crucial if we are to prevent homelessness from happening. Certainly in Scotland at the moment, a number of local authorities are declaring a housing emergency. There's lack of available housing. There's progressive legislation, but at the same time, a lot of barriers because of resources, and that resource is not only in local authorities, but advice provision and other organisations. And I think that testing, learning, evaluating is really what is going to help us to be able to address root causes and move forward positively in protecting housing rights and preventing homelessness from happening in the first place. That is me. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Aaliya. That was fascinating. And I think some really clear messages there about the importance of the legal framework, whether that be in Scotland, in the UK or internationally, but then implementation and resources being absolutely key to making that a reality. And a theme that we've heard in the earlier session today about collaboration and relationships being absolutely critical to making this stuff happen. So yeah, really strong messages. And I'm sure many of the frontline workers in the audience know how important those relationships are, particularly if we've not got the framework in place that makes sure everyone has their rights. It's those relationships and partnerships which can advance those really, particularly for those marginalised groups as well. Next up, we've got JJ giving the perspective from Shelter Cymru. Thanks, JJ.
Prynhawn da, and good afternoon. Thank you for the invite. So this next 10 minutes is a focus on Wales and housing advice challenges and housing advice availability in Wales. you may have noticed that Wales had devolution from 1999, and housing law is one of the devolved areas. So Wales has been in charge of its own housing laws since then, and we've seen quite a lot of new laws in housing. We've had laws relating to homelessness and more recently laws relating to tenancy law. So there is you know, apart from housing costs, pretty much all of housing law is now different in Wales. So that's something that's the first basic to be aware of. So who are Shelter Cymru? Well, Shelter Cymru are an independent charity, so they are separate from Shelter England and Scotland. They did come out of the same campaign initially, but when they were set up in Wales, they were always separate, and actually our real name is Welsh Housing Aid. Like Shelter in England and Scotland, we are a rights-based organisation, and we're a kind of twin approach of service delivery, mainly housing advice and rights, but through the learning of that, campaigning and lobbying and seeking to influence change for a much larger group of people. So in Wales, we're about 120 staff, about 90 or so are involved in services. Our main kind of mainstream services, housing advice. We deliver a little bit of debt and welfare benefits and some housing support and some particular projects for things like prisons. The main focus is housing advice. We've got 6 offices around Wales, so we are a national organisation. We're spread fairly far and wide. Next slide, please. So it seems important to set the need for advice in the context of the housing emergency in Wales, and I am sure this doesn't differ from the other devolved nations that we're hearing about this morning, but just to take a quick look at the situation in Wales, if we could have the next slide, please. And apologies, these figures are about 18 months out of date, but I can update some of them and it gives you the general gist. So in terms of new house building, 21-22, we built 5,000 houses, of which 882 were social housing. That same year, our waiting list for social housing was 89,000, and that was a 40,000 increase over the 4 years prior to that. So an enormous mismatch between house building, particularly affordable house building, and demand. House prices in Wales have risen highly over the last years. They started from a lower base, so they've had further to rise. So they are equally as unaffordable as any of the other parts of the UK now. And as a consequence of that, and as a consequence of the growth in demand for private rented accommodation, in the last 10 years, we've seen a sort of 250% rise in the number of people in private rented accommodation in Wales. So an enormous rise. And the issues of demand and supply there mean this particular year, 2022, we had a nearly 10% rise in rents. Last year, we had a 8.8% rise in rents. So really inflation busting rises in rents and an awful lot of competition for the private rented accommodation that is there. So a real red hot sort of housing picture in Wales. Similarly, in the homelessness area, for very good reasons, Welsh Government, following COVID, wanted to maintain that progressive approach of everybody in. They introduced an extra priority need group of anyone who would be sleeping rough or is sleeping rough. So effectively, all homeless people now have a duty towards them. That's a great step forward, but it has meant at the minute over 11,692 people in temporary accommodation at the moment, and that was up from about 3,000 pre-pandemic. So a threefold, fourfold growth in people in temporary accommodation, with all the challenges that goes along for local authorities in sourcing that temporary accommodation. And all the difficulties sometimes in people getting in the front door of having a duty accepted, because there is such extreme pressure on the system. And finally, in terms of rough sleeping, we have seen some people falling back. The figures at the minute, I think there are about 150 people in a rough sleep account, which obviously is a fairly rough estimate, but I suppose that's flagging that the duty itself isn't enough to meet the needs of some people with the most complex needs who continue to sleep rough in Wales. So picture in Wales, you know, rather red hot. I've worked for Shelter Cymru for 33 years, and it's, you know, there's always been a housing crisis, but I've never seen it quite as dire as it is at the minute. Next slide, please. So Shelter Cymru's offer, and we should say that in terms of the agency referrals to our housing advice services, support agencies make up about 26%. They're our biggest referrer. So it's a really key relationship, I think, in preventing homelessness. And it works extremely well working in tandem, in conjunction with a support worker to progress a case and progress a legal case. So it's a setup that works really well for us. And if this session helps some other support workers be aware of what we offer and the opportunities to work together, then that's really brilliant. So I'm just going to go through the normal platforms that will be of no surprise to you. So Shelter Cymru offer advice online, similar to Shelter in England and Scotland. There are 500 pages of information and advice on Welsh law and options online. It started off as a very sort of flat volume, but now it's very interactive. There's videos, there's downloadable tools and things. There's a navigation bot to help you find your way around. So it's a really good resource. So I wouldn't, a backdrop to this is that there is more demand than supply that we are able to meet in terms of housing advice. So generally, we would be encouraging people to, if their situation is non-urgent, to have a look online. It's not the poor option. It does have a lot of information. Next slide, please. Online also, you find the front door to some of our other services. So there's a web chat service, which is really popular. Some people find that's really good for a quick query. You know, there's no hassle. You're in, you're out. It may be less suited to a more complex query, but for a quick query, that really works for some people. We've got a helpline service now, which is taking the majority of our new calls and new work, which is open 9 to 5 Monday to Friday. If we and we also have local on the ground services. Next slide, please. So the helpline is really focused on more urgent work. We're getting about 2,000 calls a month. We're answering about 60 to 70% of them. So there's a bit of a wait, but the majority of people will get through on that. And we're dealing with a whole range of sort of urgent housing and homelessness issues via the helpline. Next slide, please. We've got community outreach. So, you know, some people are much more comfortable with face-to-face for some issues. If you've got a Tesco's carrier bag full of papers, a local advice surgery is a good place for you. You can walk them on the table and go through them with a caseworker. So we've got 23 outlets working from the offices of others, citizens advice bureaus, libraries, a range of sort of community venues. Next slide, please. Also present in court. So if a client sort of suddenly waives a notice that of a court hearing that they hadn't told you about because they didn't want to open the letter, there's advice available on the day at the hearing for all of the Welsh courts for sort of block listings of possession hearings. Our advisors run duty desks at all of the county courts. We've also got a small team of experienced housing solicitors, so cases that do need to progress further into a challenge or a litigation or a judicial review challenge, that those are undertaken as well. Next slide, please. Context of the advice given. A lot about local authorities' duties to people at risk of homelessness. As we said, temporary accommodation is in such scarce supply that there can be arguments at the front door as to whether a duty is owed to somebody. So there's a lot of work around that. There's a lot of work about landlord licensing, which is a really positive thing. It has implications if you're not licensed to what you can do as a landlord, whether you can collect rent, whether you can take possession proceedings. That's something we can help with. Always social housing allocations decisions. Disrepair is certainly strong at the minute. We're seeing it in about 15% of all the work coming to us. Tenancy rights in the private rented sector. The validity of notices. Again, one of the things with a lot of new legislation in Wales is there are a lot of new requirements for landlords. It's very easy to get it wrong. We're all finding our feet still, and quite a proportion of the notices that we see aren't actually valid. Harassment, illegal eviction, succession rights crops up a lot. Next slide, please. Housing benefit, mortgage and rent arrears is a real staple of the work that we're doing. And antisocial behaviour, social landlords are exercising quite a lot of restraint in Wales about taking action for rent arrears. They're not really taking action unless the rent arrears get very high, but they are taking action around antisocial behaviour, so there's plenty of that. And general other housing options advice and things around deposits and lettings bans. So where best to refer clients? Next slide, please. And in terms of those channels, again, if it's non-urgent, we'd really encourage you to support the client to look online and see if the answers that they need are there. If it's more urgent or a website, it just isn't for them, then there's the web chat and the helpline. If you know that they will need face-to-face, maybe they've got a court hearing, they're going to need representation, then you can ring right through to our local teams and skip out the other steps. And in the next slide, we see which I hope will go round to you all. There's the various contact numbers there for our local teams, our helplines, and there's the links there for our website, our online website. Thank you, Katie.
Amazing. Thank you so much, JJ. That was really informative, and I'm sure that all the frontline workers who are working in Wales have absolutely drank that information in, and I'm sure presentations will be circulated after the conference so that you can take all that information in. But really good to hear the different examples of work that you do, as well as the different routes in different circumstances, and interesting as well to hear the percentage of cases that come through from referrals from support agencies, and also how useful that is working in partnership with support agencies. So I'm sure that's something that frontline workers in Wales will take back to them. Now, last but certainly not least, we've got Jill, who's a solicitor with Housing Rights Northern Ireland. Welcome, Jill. Really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Katie. Yes, delighted to be able to share the perspective from Northern Ireland, which sounds very similar to that in Scotland and in Wales, and just show what services we have to deliver. So Housing Rights is actually 60 years old this year, so 60 years of experience, but sadly our advice is still very much needed for those who are accessing housing or trying to retain their housing. So just moving through the slides, next one. So we do offer advocacy mediation training specifically for Northern Ireland, and also hope to sort of really tackle the root causes of housing problems with the aim of influencing government for new laws and policies and solutions. So really, if we can try and prevent homelessness, that's really the best way to approach it ultimately. and all of our staff and volunteers really believe that everyone should have a home. So our next slide then just confirms where we're located, with over 50 staff with volunteers, and quite a lot have legal qualifications. And so our specific services that we have our advice line, which is open Monday to Friday, and that is for the public or other agencies who we work along with. And we also have the option of online or email chat, which, as we're hearing, is often very popular, and face-to-face appointments can be provided. And since 2017, we've introduced a landlord advice system, and that has been dealing with significant numbers of inquiries. And really the idea there is to try and promote statutory compliance and good practice in the sector, so that, as we're hearing, laws are changing. Some landlords maybe only own 1 or 2 properties, don't have a lot of knowledge. And if we can encourage them to follow the correct laws and procedures, then that's going to work well for our tenants. So yes, it's simply open Monday to Friday, and it can be available by telephone or email. It's only available for private landlords who are registered, so that encourages landlords to be registered to gain access to this advice. So we can also provide advocacy and casework. So if a case requires more work than a general telephone inquiry, there can be advocacy provided for areas such as the mortgage repossession, rent arrears, homelessness, appeals tribunals, and sustaining tenancies, maybe maximising points for people to move on to suitable accommodation. And we also similarly have provision for attending court in relation to possession cases for both mortgages and rent arrears. So they can attend the High Court and the County Court to assist on the day of the hearings. And that has been very much welcomed by the courts themselves. They find that our level of representation is good, and that people are accessing that help, and if need be, may be able to get a payment plan in place that will hopefully allow them to stay in their home. So that's very much a great service. Yes, we've also introduced a housing mediation service for the private rented sector, because as we're hearing, that's where a lot of people now are having to look to find accommodation. And with this pilot scheme, which is being funded by the Department for Communities, it's been a really good service and providing great work. So it's free and accessible to private rented tenants, also again with registered landlords, and also letting agents. So really, it's the alternative dispute resolution. It's helping the parties to come to a shared understanding of their differences, to resolve issues. The mediator is assisting them to work together to resolve their issues. And whilst it's voluntary, it's also informal, which is helpful. It's confidential and without prejudice to hopefully court proceedings will not have to issue as a result. So the good thing is it's Northern Ireland wide, very accessible, it's free and quick, hopefully avoiding the need to go to court, and the parties are in control of the agreement, which with mediation it's hoped then will result in maybe a high compliance rate. So we're seeing sustained tenancies, and the success rate has been very high at 81%. So we've seen it as a very positive project and a great help to those in the private rented sector. We also work a lot with other housing advice agencies so that we can ensure that there's good quality housing advice through all communities throughout Northern Ireland. And there are approximately 30 other advice agencies who are involved in the partnership who would refer matters into ourselves, and if they require then additional advocacy, that can be provided. So similarly, we also are working within the prisons in Northern Ireland, and that's on entering prison to ensure that clients notify their housing association landlord that they're in prison, so there'll be no abandonment proceedings would be started. and also to ensure that their benefits are paid whilst they're in prison. And that's important so that when they're released, then they do have housing to return to ultimately. So in addition to that, we have a project called Beyond the Gate. So that's really identifying individuals who need additional support, who are vulnerable and maybe would have difficulty sustaining their tenancy when they're released from prison. So our staff would work with them before they're released to ensure that they're going to have a home to come out to, ensure their benefits are in place, maybe appointments with a GP, ensure that services are in place for them, maybe get them a mobile phone, all those things that are essential now for accessing benefits, and also ensuring they can access benefits to get provision for housing, and also then goods and furniture and things that are going to make somewhere a home that hopefully will minimise the risk of returning to prison again. So just our next slide then. We also have another project which we think is very important, is specifically for young people in the age group of 18 to 29, because this could be this young person's first experience of living independently, and they might need additional support, both for benefits, paying their rent, budgeting, and making sure that they're paying all that needs to be paid. So it's been a very popular service, and our staff work very hard on behalf of young people and have built up a good network of other support agencies in the area to try and ensure that they can sustain their tenancies, and if there are problems, that they can be supported to actually address those issues without actually losing their home. So we can also help with the private rented sector for young people, helping them gain access to deposits, ensuring they know what their rights are, and in the worst case scenario, presenting as homeless, and accessing temporary accommodation. So I think in relation to young people, just the next slide just highlights again some of the other work that we have successfully carried out on behalf of young people in particular. And as we're seeing, repairs is often an ongoing issue for many tenants. So the young person service can be accessed by telephone or email or live chat, and also referral by third parties on behalf of young people. We have another project which is Renter's Voice, which has proved very popular. It's for the private rented scheme, and it's really for renters to come together to identify ways that renting could be made better, to have a voice that would be heard by politicians and government. They played a very important role when we had recent changes to private rented legislation for periods for notice to quit. They were able to kind of highlight practical problems. So we would organise meetings, get people together, and they've been included in presentations to government, which has been very empowering for people, and gives that lived experience angle to the work that we're doing. We also have a policy and research team, and so they're really utilising the evidence that we're gathering with our work with clients to try and bring about improvements then in legislation and policy and practice for people in Northern Ireland. And like other services, the online and web page provides a great way to give detailed information to people and other agencies, so that they can access that at any time and get detailed information, and would provide publications. And similarly, I think training is also a very important role, so that we can share our experience and our knowledge to other agencies so that they can increase their knowledge. I know in particular, just understanding how the selection scheme works and how points can be awarded to individuals. A lot of agencies welcome that, in particular Women's Aid, once they can see how that works, and they can act on that themselves and increase points for people, so that hopefully they're further up the housing list and can gain permanent housing quickly. So other areas that we've done training on is antisocial behaviour, how to address that and prevent possession orders being made. And as we've heard earlier this morning, the link between mental health and housing is an important link, and much more needs to be done in that area. And if we can work together with others and increase their learning, that'll be very beneficial. I think that's the end of my presentation, Katie.
Thanks very much, Jill. That was really interesting, really comprehensive information about the services that you provide, and really good to hear about some of the particular projects that you run, and certainly that the pilot mediation service sounds really interesting in supporting people to avoid having to go through the court process, and you know what looks like a really fantastic success rate that, you know, I imagine reducing significantly the amount of trauma that people face by avoiding that route. So thank you very much. Thank you to all three. Really great presentations, and really interesting to hear some of the similarities across the different nations, but also some of the different things that you're focused on. Big thank you to Aaliya, who has been answering some of the specific questions that you've got expertise in the chat. So thank you very much indeed. Please do feel free to submit additional questions. We've got some already and we'll work through those, but try and get as many as possible in before we get to the end of the session. So one of the questions in the chat is asking whether legal aid, no-cost legal aid is available for rough sleepers or people who is in temporary supported accommodation or rehab. I'm not sure whether anyone on the panel wants to come in, but I've certainly got a briefing in front of me that has been shared in advance of this session that it very much comes with a caveat of you might get free legal help if you have a serious housing problem, or and if you get benefits or have a low income. So I think there's lots of kind of categories that you have to kind of fit into in order to have a chance of getting legal aid. But certainly if you are on universal credit, pension credit guarantee, income related employment and support allowance, income based job seekers allowance or income support, you know, my briefing says that you can usually get legal aid in those circumstances. They'll also probably want to know about whether you have savings or whether you have equity in your property that plays into that judgment. But those are some of the criteria that they look at in order to qualify for that. I think all of that is caveated with, you know, what most people will be aware of the kind of significant pressure on legal aid and the cuts that it's faced over certainly the last decade or so. And the Law Society in February said that every single provider of legal aid for housing cases in England and Wales is making a loss due to the decimation of the housing legal aid budget. So I think in turn that means that lots of providers are kind of pulling out because they're unable to make it stack up, and it's threatening the sustainability of their organisation, and also, you know, may well be having to compromise in terms of the quantity and detail of the support and advice they're able to offer because they're so stretched in terms of those budgets. So you know, I think clearly an area that all of us within the sector would want to see more investment in legal aid and it being made available to more people. But I'm assured that this briefing will be circulated to attendees after this conference. So please do keep an eye out for that because it does have a lot more detail in. But in terms of alternatives to legal aid in England, obviously we've heard today from representatives from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but in England there's the Law Centres Network, Citizens Advice and Advice Now. So do look those up if you're looking for some free advice at the moment. I don't know whether any of the panel want to come in on that. I was just wary that I'd been given a briefing in advance and wanted to make sure I highlighted the right things. JJ, do you want to come in first?
I think it's worth saying sometimes the legal sector and legal advice is thought about as something over there, and other advice is something over there. But probably I think all the agencies represented here are actually a blend, will be a blend of some statutory funding, some fundraising, some legal aid funding. So the earlier parts of the work tend to have less strings attached and less criteria, and we can work with everyone. When we're actually getting into the court space, when costs are incurred with barristers and representatives or cost risks, then we're really into the legal aid space. But I think you described it perfectly from your briefing there. You know, that example, you'd expect somebody who's homeless to be eligible for legal aid if the matter is within scope, and if it's about homelessness, it will be in scope.
Thanks very much, JJ. And I guess that points to getting in touch as early as possible in order to try and resolve that issue and get the right advice before it escalates to that point where the cost, risk, benefit equation comes into it. Thanks very much. Aaliya, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you very much, Katie. Yeah, very similar to what JJ has outlined in terms of individual organisations' ability to be able to provide legal advice and representation. In Scotland, the Scottish Legal Aid Board is the relevant agency that administers legal aid, and there are two elements. There's advice and assistance, and then civil legal aid, which is required if the case is going to the Sheriff Court. It is means tested, but there is a very useful resource on the Scottish Legal Aid Board's website to be able to see whether someone's entitled to legal aid or not. And the Law Society of Scotland will also have a list of practitioners that undertake legal aid work. But yeah, somebody who is experiencing homelessness based on sort of any income and savings would be able to see if they are entitled to legal aid. Thanks
very much. JJ, do you want to come back in?
Sorry, a key point that I should have said was in England and Wales currently there's a pilot scheme, but it operates everywhere. It's called the Help Us scheme. It's a home loss prevention advisory service. It is for things that funds the advisors under legal aid to work from court. The great thing about that is that there is no eligibility, there's no financial eligibility. If you have received a notice and you're at risk of losing your property, then you fall under that funding. So it's people shouldn't be put off if they've got clients who've received notice. Potentially there's a stream of legal aid available to help them.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, JJ. And just to mention, there's a few different resources that are being put in the chat. So do take a look at that. And Jane quite rightly has mentioned the Frontline Network Training Fund. So many of you may well be aware of Vickers Relief Fund and the funds that can help clients, but there's also a really important Frontline Network Training Fund. So if you're looking to access some training that costs you money and you need some help with that, you can apply to the training fund. So that might well be helpful in the area of legal advice. So we've had another question in about trends. So what are the trends that you're seeing in terms of some of the legal advice and the casework in your respective nations? Be really interested to hear whether there are similarities across the different nations or whether there are some differences as well. Not sure who might want to go in first about the trends in your nation. Great, Aaliya, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Where to start, Katie? That's probably the sort of more of the challenge. I suppose some of the things that we are seeing is rent arrears that are at significantly higher levels than we have ever seen. That is a contribution of the aftermath of the pandemic, people who already had rent arrears prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic sort of making it worse, and then the cost of living. So we've just like literally gone from one crisis to the next, What we're also seeing is a fluctuation in terms of income and the impact of that. So where people are perhaps losing, where they're sort of either on 0-hour contracts or the impact on their universal credit, and then going back, and then sort of just it's compounding and adding to complications in terms of their rent arrears, deductions that are taken from their rent arrears. And I suppose on that point, and particularly sort of escalation, where somebody is having a higher level deducted from their universal credit for rent arrears, then that is a point where you would want to escalate it for legal advice so that can be challenged. So we have noted that. And I suppose I'm highlighting cases where you have a common trend, but also cases where they might be isolated, but it's important that people know that there is a route to be able to legally challenge that. A lot of local authorities in Scotland, people may have heard, are declaring housing emergencies. So the number of people that are in temporary accommodation for longer than they should be, the temporary accommodation being unsuitable, and particularly for asylum seekers and refugee communities, accommodation in hotels, accommodation in areas where there isn't the infrastructure to support people. And yeah, just I think, as JJ had said, I think, you know, being in this sector, in the voluntary sector, I don't think I've ever seen things as tight and as stretched as they are, and the impact this is having on, first and foremost, the people, but also who are experiencing the housing issues, but also people that are trying to support them. So those are sort of the high level things that I'd say from our end. The final point I will say in terms of work and people in prison, that again, because of the pandemic, the period of time that they're on remand is much longer than has been before as well. So we're noting that, and that obviously does have an impact on the fact that it's longer, and it's having an impact in terms of their entitlement to be able to continue to have that housing benefit or universal credit, which is then adding to the difficulties.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Thanks very much. Jill, do you want to come in?
Yes, I just wanted to confirm that sadly we're also experiencing major problems with suitable temporary accommodation. It was bad sort of after the pandemic, but we've had, like the rest of the UK, a lot of asylum seekers granted their asylum and then immediately looking to the Housing Executive for housing, and whilst they've been temporarily living in Belfast in hotels and other accommodation, now they're moving out 20-30 miles out of Belfast with children at school, and that's been a huge problem, trying to get suitable alternative accommodation for those families. So we're seeing some improvement in that, but similarly we're also finding, particularly for single men in particular, really all they're being offered is hostels, and notwithstanding that a lot of clients may have mental health problems or addictions and find the hostels not suitable, the availability of single let properties for single men is just not there, and it's very difficult, and many are sleeping rough, which is very, very concerning for housing rights. And like Aaliya was saying, we're seeing the prisoners on remand for much longer, and it's a very big concern then that people are going to lose their tenancies and start off then back in the homeless sector again. So tough times, and tough for advisors dealing with that as well.
Yeah, I can absolutely imagine. JJ, the perspective from Wales.
A lot of commonality, Katie. We're seeing rent possession actions, particularly no-fault evictions, very high, higher than pre-pandemic. We're seeing the new legislation in Wales about tenancies, and England, well, it has its version coming along the train tracks. You know, just has created a lot of need for clarity. So about 10% of our work is answering queries about what type of tenancies do I have now. Homelessness, as we've heard, huge pressure on temporary accommodation. So there are issues about families in temporary accommodation with very, very limited cooking facilities, for months. There are issues about people with complex needs duties being discharged, asked to leave temporary accommodation because it hasn't been right for their needs, and there are issues about people getting through the front door in the first place. That issue about the complexity of the need presented, I think, comes across really strongly. Something there about the austerity years and the limits on mental health services, things. People, the feedback again from the sector in Wales as well as our own staff is that people are presenting with a lot more complex needs, and that runs along with there being much more limited housing options, primarily because of affordability. So those combinations is very challenging, and I think as Aaliya said, it's also challenging from the staff dealing with it. Our staff are having a tough time. They're finding it really challenging, both with the needs of clients. So again, that partnership with support agencies can work so well. You know, together we can move a case forward where without that additional support, we probably wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, and we talked earlier in the opening session of that kind of the impact on morale when it feels impossible to find solutions for the person that you're supporting. I think most people get into certainly the not-for-profit kind of areas like this to make a difference to people's lives, and often compromise on, you know, pay and the rest of it because that they care passionately about what they're doing. But it's becoming increasingly difficult for frontline workers because they're not able to secure that change that they want on behalf of the people that they're supporting. And, you know, it must feel, whether you're a support worker or someone providing legal advice, really, really challenging at the moment. And, you know, big shout out to all of those frontline workers who continue to turn up every day and do what is an incredibly difficult job. And I hope they know the positive difference that they do make, even though they are facing barriers. We are grateful, immensely grateful to all those workers out there doing these amazing jobs. We've had a question in the chat. It's asking about Scotland, but it's probably relevant to all of the areas actually. With the current housing crisis, are people's right to entitlement to temporary housing, are these being denied by local authorities because of that lack of capacity? And I guess the rights to temporary accommodation are different in the different nations. But if we start off, Aaliya, with Scotland, where there is no priority need anymore, so everyone should have access to temporary accommodation. But are you seeing people being denied that because of capacity and pressure?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I thought I'm not really sure I can answer it in typing in the chat. I'm trying to think of the most thoughtful way to answer this. Local authorities are stretched, but their obligations remain. So they are obliged to ensure that people do receive, they are assessed, that they do receive temporary accommodation. And I suppose going back to the point that JJ just made about sort of collaboration, that it is so crucial that organisations are collaborating with each other so that there is the legal challenge. We certainly do find that where local authorities are not meeting their obligations, that, you know, a threat of a judicial review will change the situation. So yeah, whilst local authorities are stretched, and I think, you know, one of the things is, whilst having legislation being progressive is really important, being able to exercise that is crucial, but all of the providers equally need to be resourced if that legislation is really to have good effect, and that's something that we're certainly discussing in Scotland, that's the recognition of the impact for local authorities. But their statutory obligation does not change, and where somebody is not getting the rights that they are entitled to, that definitely refer for legal advice so that an appropriate challenge can be made.
Yeah, and JJ, you highlighted figures earlier that showed that although, you know, you talked about the addition of street homelessness to the priority need category, which should therefore capture the vast majority of people, actually the numbers of people who are on the streets and not in temporary accommodation are still significant, aren't they? And are you, through your casework, seeing people's rights being refused for various reasons?
Yes, we are. It is a major plank of our casework at the moment. And again, to put it in context, that is in no way criticising the extent to which local authorities have had to gear up and kind of, you know, make a real step change in the level of support that they're providing. You know, we're in regular contact. We know Welsh Government are in regular contact. They are pulling out every stop to try and make more temporary accommodation available. But they don't have enough, and that does mean that they are making some harder decisions. And there, you know, in Wales there are homelessness waiting lists in certain places. It's not a concept that exists. You can't have a homelessness waiting list if you've got if being street homeless gives you a priority need. Yeah, we still have it. Again, taking Aaliya's point. I think we are really keen to collaborate because they're working on individual cases. There is a real sense of rearranging the deck chairs, that the person we're working with will, okay, we found them some temporary accommodation, but we're very conscious that, you know, the person behind them who didn't come to us won't get that temporary accommodation. So we're much keener on trying to tackle the practice rather than the individual case. And that does sometimes mean a different type of legal challenge and building up a picture of a pattern. And we can't always do that ourselves. We kind of look to partners for examples to help us do that.
And it comes to, you know, that point that Aaliya made earlier around it's all well and good having a really progressive legal framework and some really nice words on bits of paper and on legislation.org, but if it's not implemented, if it's not resourced, then, you know, then you're not going to see the kind of impact on all people. We've got 9 minutes left. I want to fit in a couple more questions. So we've got one in the chat, and actually this has been reflected in a few comments during this session actually about people. So this example is someone that might have a client who's got ADHD or autism, and they're told it's not significant enough to deem the individual to have priority need. And, you know, we've seen similar comments on people's mental health. So we don't deem it as significant enough for you to qualify for priority need or for support. Do any of you have reflections on, you know, seeing that play out and any ways that you've kind of tried to support people to get the right result for them in some of those disputes with local authorities? Aaliya, thanks very much.
That is such a good point, and I suppose not specific to housing, but also in a lot of welfare benefit decisions where whether we're talking about ADHD and autism or whether we're talking about mental health, that decision makers are saying this is not serious enough for us to be considering it. And I think what I would say here is, again, sort of legally challenging it. So for example, we noted that a local authority was not taking mental health issues into consideration where they were making decisions. So we legally challenged it, and the change that we noted would not necessarily an immediate positive outcome in that the decision didn't all of a sudden become from a no to a yes, but that what we noted was in the decisions, they were starting to specifically say, we have looked at this and this is what our response is. I would say, particularly in terms of sort of hidden disabilities, that again, getting legal advice and challenging, and again, on the point of sort of building that bit of a trend, because one of the things that we certainly do, and I'm sure our partner organisations also do, is build that evidence to then be able to have those conversations, whether it be with civil servants in the Scottish Government, whether it be with ministers, whether it be be with organisations themselves to say, right, this is what we're finding, this is what we're going to do about it, and then seeing that end outcome. So sometimes to achieve that strategic change doesn't necessarily need to go through strategic litigation in the sense of raising proceedings. It's about how do we still achieve that legal outcome that it has a strategic long-term impact. And certainly, I would say, the more you challenge it, the more you ask those questions, the more people are going to have to go away and start to look at what their obligations are.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. JJ, Jill, do either of you want to add anything to that? JJ, I can see you're about
I was just going to come from a slightly different angle, particularly in the kind of devolved nations where that priority need isn't the immediate barrier anymore. But having temporary accommodation suitable for everyone's needs is a barrier, and there is something about setting people up to fail. You know, it's too common a path that the TA breaks down and the duties are discharged, and you know, when there is it is in such short supply. Asking for a real diverse range, you know, it seems like a big ask, but it is what people need. And there is, I know Welsh Government at the minute are having a think about the concept of homeless from home, which is a it's a complicated legal concept because it conflicts with the other bits of, but the idea that, you know, you don't have to go into that particular hostel or that particular supported place, you know, because it just doesn't work for everyone, and it's very predictable that it won't work out.
all comes back down to supply, doesn't it? In the end, if we have greater supply, then the rationing that goes on with the application, rightly or wrongly, with some of the legal duties is less necessary. Jill, do you want to come in?
Yes, Katie, I was just going to say that, you know, it can be very difficult to get a medical report detailing, you know, the client's issues, and sometimes that's maybe where a support worker would be beneficial. If the support worker can provide a written report detailing how the client's conditions are impacting on their everyday life, you know, as regards maybe budgeting or dealing with people and managing, and whether the support worker can access maybe a disability social worker, making sure the individual has all the other support they need, who then can perhaps provide some evidence that sadly we still have to prove priority need in Northern Ireland. So yeah, we're definitely looking for that advice and trying to make the case for the person.
Great, another really strong call there for collaboration between support workers and legal advisors that we've heard throughout this session. We've got 3 minutes left, and we've got one more question that I'd like to put to you, and that's specifically about the routes for legal advice and support if you've got no recourse to public funds. I know this is something that a lot of support workers really struggle with in understanding how they can best help people with no recourse to public funds. So just wondering if very briefly any of you have any advice on that. Jill, thank you very much.
Well, probably as the other services, we can provide general advice and advocacy, so that would still be available. We would often work with the Law Centre in Belfast as well to give advice to individuals. But of course, then if it's got to go to court, then that's the alternative. One other course that we have is the PILS group, which is public interest litigation. So if the case is going to have a public interest, human rights angle to the case, then it could be that we could get funding for the individual through the PILS. So there are a few options that are available without recourse to legal aid.
Great, thanks, Jill. That's really helpful. And I guess always ask the question would be the top kind of bit of advice to support workers who are unsure. Aaliya, do you want to come in?
I think in terms of no recourse to public funds, Jill makes a really important point in terms of, you know, making sure that people do have access to advice. specific to their circumstances. And I think in terms of no recourse to public funds, it's also important for us to realise the number of people that impacts. So whether it's students, whether it's people who are here that can work but are not able to access benefits. Certainly in Scotland, there are a few things that would highlight. So being able to submit an application and get a tenancy from a housing association is not a public fund. If you were referred through a local authority, through a homelessness route, then it would be. So sort of just knowing that distinction. And I think also it would be important that you do get legal advice, but there are certain obligations under the Children's Scotland Act, under the Social Work Act, and under mental health as well, to be able for the local authority to provide support to somebody who may be subject to no recourse to public funds, but they do have obligations because either there is a child involved or there are mental health issues. So those are sort of, I think, I suppose, very quickly a few things to highlight.
Thanks very much, Aaliya. That's really, really helpful. We have reached 1 o'clock. I'd like to say a massive thank you to the panel. Extraordinary expertise that you've brought to this session, and a load of comments in the chat saying how helpful and interesting this session has been. So I think it's been really welcomed by people and really helped them to either find out more or get some reassurance that they're doing it right back in their day job. We'll make sure that presentations and the briefing that I mentioned earlier are circulated to people. We've now got, I think, a 45-minute break until the next session, which will be the Wellbeing Roundtable, and we've got a bunch of different perspectives coming to that. And then there'll be another round of kind of breakout on inequality of mental health and housing, children and families in temporary accommodation, understanding hoarding, and system leadership. So some fantastic sessions for the rest of this afternoon. I hope you take a break, grab some lunch, relax a bit, get some non-screen time, and then hopefully we'll see you back for this afternoon's sessions. Thank you again, Diolch yn fawr iawn to the panel. It's been absolutely fantastic and really appreciate your time and your expertise. Thank you.